On his last morning on Earth, Arthur was tired. This is how Chapter 53 of Station 11 begins, a novel by Canadian author Emily St. John Mandel, published in 2014. He made his last breakfast, scrambled eggs, and showered, dressed, combed his hair, left for the theater an hour early, so he'd have time to linger with a newspaper over his second-to-last coffee at his favorite coffee place. All of the small details that comprise morning, a life. Over some 20 pages, the author recounts the day of Arthur Lender, a day that, as we know, will end with his death on stage during a performance of King Lear. It's an event we've already witnessed through the eyes of another character, Jivan, in the very first chapter of the book. Arthur is not the protagonist of this story. Still, several narratives revolve around him, and he's a recurring figure, reappearing at different moments of the plot at various times in his life. Throughout the book, we learn that Arthur was once an aspiring actor, then a movie star, and later an aging performer trying his hand at theater. We know he has 3 ex-wives, a new lover, half his age, and a son living abroad with his mother. We know Arthur has regrets. We know Arthur is going to die. He doesn't. Do you often think about your own death? More precisely about what your final moments might be like? Will you be surrounded by your family, offering each of them a tender word before you pass peacefully? Will you die by accident, hit by a car, seeing your life flash before your eyes just before impact? Will you die in your sleep while dreaming? Lately, I've often found myself thinking about that moment. The moment of death, the final thoughts before everything stops. We spend so much time thinking about how to live well. I have a feeling we also think about how to die well. Enjoying one last good meal, having a final touching gesture, saying memorable last words. And really, it makes sense. A good ending matters. But the question I can't stop asking myself is, what goes through a person's mind as they are dying? It's terrifying to imagine that we will one day have final thoughts, that our brain, which produces thousands of ideas every day, will at some point generate one last thought and then stop. The final proof that we were alive. And then darkness. What's happening inside Arthur's head? A man who is about to die, but who doesn't know it. During his last commute to work, his last meal at a restaurant, his final phone call with his son. How much meaning should we assign to the details that come back to him? The fragments of life that resurface in his memory without signaling that it's for the last time. His ex-wife, drawing, her face focused. The diner he used to visit with his best friend as a young man. The pink magnolias in his garden. Later in the chapter, Emily St. John Mandel writes about Arthur. He found he was a man who repented almost everything. Regrets crowding in around him like moths to a light. This was actually the main difference between 21 and 51, he decided. The sheer volume of regret. Before dying, even if only instinctively, does a man focus on his regrets? On what he didn't do, rather than on what he accomplished? Perhaps, in that instant, he learns a life lesson, one that, if learned earlier, might have allowed to live more fully, more truthfully, in less regrettable way. But what good is a life lesson learned by a man who is about to die? Arthur days goes on, then comes the fateful evening. He's on stage, he's King Lear, standing before the audience. And this was when it happened. A sharp pain, a clenching, a weight on his chest. He held his hand to his chest and it seemed to him that he had done this before, something familiar in the motion. When he was 7 years old on Delano Island, he and his brother had found a wounded bird on the beach. Arthur cradled his hand to his heart exactly as he'd held the bird. He wasn't sure where he was anymore, or perhaps he was in 2 places at once. He could hear the waves on the beach. What he remembered from that day at the beach when he was 7 was that the bird's heart had stopped in the palm of his hand, a fluttering that faltered and went still. Arthur fell against a pillar and began to slide, and now snow was falling all around him, shining in the lights. He thought it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. What goes through a person's mind as they are dying? The beauty of the fake snow falling around them on stage? The bird they saw die 44 years ago? The mountain of regrets they have accumulated? I love this chapter because it contrasts the concrete reality of Arthur's death with his final thoughts. He dies on stage, dressed as a king. Isn't that the ultimate moment for an actor? Isn't that a meaningful death? Didn't the most famous French playwright of all time, Molière, also died on stage during the performance of one of his plays? In truth, he didn't. That's a myth. He fainted on stage, but passed away later that day at home. Still, it seems that circumstances can be rewritten if they make for a better story to pass down. And deep down, I think there's a fear rooted within us that our final moment will be trivial, that the world, or even just those closest to us, will eventually forget about it. Unlike Molière, Arthur truly dies on stage. He gets his mythical final moment. Yet, in his mind, after an ordinary, tiring day, he remembers a bird and marvels at fake snow. Final thoughts that maybe hold meaning. Wasn't that birdie's first encounter with death? But that mostly reveal we are not masters of our own mind, that it will wander wherever it pleases, until the end. But once again, Arthur never realized it was the end.
Thrash to break from gravity. What now could slow the drop? All I'd give for toes to touch the safety back at top. I changed my mind, but this is it. The deed is done. Silence drowns the sound. Before I leaped, I should have seen the view from halfway down. No, I really should have thought about the view from halfway down.
In The View from Halfway Down, the penultimate episode of the final season of Bojack Horseman, Bojack dies. It's made fairly obvious from the start of the episode. Bojack, accompanied by Sarah Lynn, the former child star he was a father figure for, who died because of him 3 seasons earlier, knocks on the door of a large mansion. Bojack's mother, who died the previous season, opens the door and invites them in. At the end of the hallway, we can hear voices, and one of them seems to be Herb Kazaz, Bojack's former best friend, buried at the beginning of season 2. Bojack is surrounded by people already dead, yet, throughout the episode, he insists on explaining that this is just a dream he often has. He dines with all these people, his best friend, his mother, even his uncle he never met. Then, once dinner is over, everyone goes to see a show. He can never follow them. That's when he wakes up. Every time. But right from the start, something feels off. Bojack doesn't quite realize it, but it's clear that this dinner isn't going as it should. Strange details start creeping into the familiar dream. The most important one being the sudden arrival of Bojack's father in the middle of dinner. Bojack even notes that it's the first time his father has ever joined in, but doesn't think much of it. The evening goes on, the guests each sharing their greatest joy and their worst moment. Then, when dinner ends, they slip away to attend the show. And Bojack doesn't wake up. Despite his efforts to open his eyes, he's still in that big mansion, and the celebration continues in the next room. Though something strange is definitely happening, he decides to join in. Let me ask you again, what goes through a person's mind as they are dying? Do they think about the people who died before them and the guilt over what happened? Better question, what happens when a person realizes they are dying? When they realize, like Bojack, that they drank, took pills, went swimming in their pool, and are not drowning? Overcome by this sudden realization, Bojack starts bargaining as his loved ones vanish one by one, swallowed by nothingness. Panicked, he turns to his old friend Herb and asks, "Has anyone ever come back from this place?"
BJ, there is no place. It's just your brain going through what it feels like it has to go through. All you can do right now.
Bojack knows it's just a dream, or a hallucination. But desperate, he starts to believe in an afterlife, that all this is real, that all this means something. Before disappearing himself, Herb drives the point home.
Oh, Bojack, no. There is no other side. This is it.
Does a man who knows he's about to die hope that it won't just end? It makes sense. When faced with death, it's only natural to try to keep it away a little longer, to hope to escape it by telling yourself it isn't really the end, and eventually to believe it, the final thought becoming the expectation of what comes after. But in fact, in his final instant, Bojack doesn't think of the afterlife. He remembers he tried to call a dear friend of his, Diane, and as she didn't pick up in real life, he imagines he's talking to her at the last moment, chatting about the most mundane of things, maybe just to hear a familiar, friendly voice as he fades away. Except Bojack doesn't die. It's revealed in the final episode that he survived the drowning, that his life goes on, and that he now has to live with the consequences of his actions. The moments he lived, the people he knew, none of it is eternal, but it doesn't all end suddenly in a tragic finale. The series remains true to its message. There is always more show. There's no happy ending or bad ending. Life simply goes on, made up of moments that follow one another. And eventually, one of them is the last, without being particularly special. So maybe it's meaningless to look for significance or attach special importance to those final moments of consciousness. Maybe it's foolish to be so focused on the end, when what truly matters is everything that came before. The last second of awareness shouldn't weigh more than the years, the decades that preceded it. Yes, it might sound cliché to say that it's not the destination but the journey that matters. And yet, there's truth in that, right? Maybe the very last instant of life isn't special at all, even if you stare at it for hours from every angle. Return of the Obra Dinn is a video game that invites you to stare at the final moments of 60 people's lives for hours and from every angle. Developed by Lucas Pope, released in 2018, the game casts you as an insurance investigator in the early 19th century. You work for the East India Company, and your task is to look into the mysterious return of the Obra Dinn, a ship that reappeared off the coast of England after having been lost at sea for 4 years. To carry out your mission, your character is given a most fitting tool, a pocket watch with a rather special power. Starting from a person's corpse, and God knows the Obra Dinn is full of corpses, the watch allows you to witness that person's final moments. Like a three-dimensional photograph, it lets you explore the scene around the dying person, to see everything happening there, even things the victim themselves could not see. The catch, however, is that everything is frozen at the exact instant life left their body. In the game, the power you've been granted is a means to discover what happened to the crew, to conduct a methodical investigation and determine the identities and causes of death of the 60 people who were on board, to tick off names from a list. For a reason that's frankly not very noble, your employer needs to know what happened on that ship in order to decide who should receive compensation. One sailor died defending the vessel, a small payment will be sent to his wife. Another tried to start a mutiny, his heirs will be fined. And that's all there is to it. As usual, the reasons that drive a company to uncover the deaths of its employees are neither altruistic nor spiritual, nor philosophical, but purely financial. Of course, you, the player, aren't here for that. You want to witness every death out of a taste for mystery, for intrigue, out of the desire to uncover what truly happened aboard the Obra Dinn. And also because, well, that's the point of the game. And indeed, the game makes you feel every death in a rather visceral way. The morbid experience of seeing a face frozen in death and hearing the last seconds of someone's life is both repulsive and fascinating. And perhaps, during your time aboard the Obra Dinn, you asked yourself the same question I did. What goes through a person's mind as they are dying? For some, it's not hard to guess, like that young crew member stabbed to death, begging not to be left alone in his final moments, or the Obra Dinn's captain apologizing to his dead wife before taking his own life. Regret, again. But what about the sailor obliterated by a point-blank cannon blast? Or the captain's wife herself, whose skull is crushed by a falling mast? A flash, and it's over. Did they have time to think of anything at all? And what about that artist who, while casting off of a board, is crushed by a giant tentacle? He must have realized he was about to die, but what could someone possibly think about while dying like that? During your passage on the Obra Dinn, you'll witness dozens upon dozens of deaths, and among them, some will certainly stay with you. But others just won't. There are, for instance, the final moments you never see, sailors lost at sea whom you can only imagine drowned or were devoured by some sea creature. But there are also those you did see and forgot. What about that sailor who died of illness early in the trip? You're given his name and cause of death right away. Have you thought about him again since you ticked his name off your list? Here's another one. Do you remember the stowaway, hidden inside a barrel, who died before the ship even set sail? When that barrel fell and hit the ground with such force that it probably broke his neck? He isn't a crew member, so you don't have his name, and there's nothing to record about him in your journal. In the game, he exists only as a means of showing you what happened at that moment to the real crew members. So you witness the events of his death. You even hear his ragged breathing from inside the barrel. But you never see his body. What expression did his face wear at the end? Fear? Confusion? Did he realize some profound truth in his final instant? So who were those final moments for then? If no one was there to witness them, they were neither for him, nor for you, nor for anyone? Did they even exist if no one saw them? If no one can remember and describe them? If there is no story left to tell? The more I think about it, the more I feel that final moments are, above all, a concept made for the living. A way to make sense of the fact that one day everything will stop. A way to rationalize the undeniable truth that everyone will die. Or perhaps a way to express our individuality one last time. If death comes for everyone, at least the final moments belong to each of us alone. My last gestures will be mine, my last thoughts too. And perhaps that's true. But the reality is, as I said before, we don't know what we'll think in our final moments. Our minds will do as they please, and we'll keep telling ourselves stories.
The house was exactly like I remembered it, the way I'd been dreaming about it.
If there's one video game where characters tell themselves stories about death, it's What Remains of Edith Finch, developed by Giant Sparrow and released in 2017. The game is known for its story that blends the wondrous with the morbid, following various members of the Finch family, almost all of whom die young and in tragic circumstances. While the family narrative revolves around the supposed curse that has haunted the Finches for generations, the discovery of each story gradually deconstructs that official version, ultimately revealing that these deaths are far more likely due to bad luck, chance, or, quite often, negligence. In What Remains of Edith Finch, every death is interpreted, distorted. It is said, for example, that Molly Finch, who died as a child, was devoured by a sea monster that had been hiding under her bed. We're even given access to her final thoughts through her diary. She writes that the monster beneath her bed is hungry, waiting for her to fall asleep, and that they both know.
I will be delicious.
Well, those are some memorable last words, final moments with a touch of flair. The most believable explanation is that the poor girl poisoned herself by eating holly berries. But in her journal, she gives birth to a legendary story, one that endures in memory. And perhaps these are just the wild imaginings of a 10-year-old hallucinating in her final moments. However, her family, and especially the family matriarch, Edie, places great importance on the contents of that diary. As with her other children and grandchildren who died prematurely, she displays their final moments. They are exhibited, preserved to be admired, like in a museum, even if they don't reflect reality, even if the story has to be bent a little. Another example is Calvin, whose death we are shown in an almost realistic way. The young boy is playing on a swing. His father, in a moment of what can only be described as questionable judgment, had attached the swing to a tree branch, right at the edge of a cliff. Pushing harder and harder with his feet, Calvin ends up being hurled over the cliff and into the sea below. We are also told that he managed to swing all the way around in a full circle, but I will allow myself some doubt there. How his twin brother, Sam, chooses to interpret his death, that is very interesting.
The thing I remember is that when he made up his mind, that was it. I think Calvin always wanted to fly, but that day, he finally made up his mind to do it. Maybe if the wind hadn't picked up, then maybe he'd still be here, but I doubt it. That's what I want to remember about my brother. The day he made up his mind to fly. And he did.
Even though he wrote this poem as a child, Sam doesn't truly believe that his brother miraculously learned to fly. Of course not. The title says it all. How I want to remember my brother. The truth, if too painful, can be reshaped. What matters is what he wants to remember. It's easy to see this as a kind of emotional distancing, a coping mechanism developed by a child to avoid facing his brother's death. Except that, many years later, when Sam is now an adult, he reacts the same way to the death of his own son, Gregory. He imagines the world through his baby's eyes, and everything becomes magical, even the child's final moments as he drowns in the bathtub, turning an otherwise harrowing death scene into something overwhelmingly joyful and whimsical, which makes it maybe the hardest scene to witness in the entire game. Except no one actually witnessed Calvin's final moments, or Gregory's. Sam was there for neither. And when faced with that emptiness, that uncertainty, Sam chooses to imagine his brother and his son happy in their last moments, free, not terrified by the fall or the water, not consumed by the instinct to survive. And in Calvin's case, his mind made up to die. Perhaps it's no coincidence that Sam, who softens others' deaths, is also the one who doesn't run from it. On the contrary, he almost seems to seek death, or at least confront it when he joins the army. By telling himself stories about the deaths of others, he's obviously trying to ease his grief, but maybe also to soften the idea of his own death, to imagine that it's possible to die happy, to tell himself that the end might not be so frightening, that in their final moments, a person might still smile. Do you know this face? It belongs to l'inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine, a young person we know very little about. She lived in Europe during the second half of the 19th century, and she committed suicide in Paris by throwing herself into the river La Seine. When her body was recovered at the beginning of the following century, it was found strangely well preserved. The corpse was taken to the morgue, where the medical examiner, struck and fascinated by the beauty and enigmatic smile of the young woman, decided to make a plaster cast of her face. In the following years, copies of the original cast were made in workshops, and the face of the unknown woman began to circulate in Paris. Gradually, the casts found their way into the cabinets of well-to-do Parisians and onto the walls of contemporary artists' studios. The cast's popularity can be attributed to the beauty of the model or the intriguing story behind the mask's creation. But there is no denying that this mysterious smile captivates and provokes questions. Why is she smiling? What was she thinking at the moment of her suicide? What goes through this woman's mind as she is dying? Throughout the 20th century, the unknown woman of the Seine became a figure frequently evoked in literature and poetry, as in this 1934 poem written by Vladimir Nabokov. Urging on this life's denouement, loving nothing upon this earth, I keep staring at the white mask of your lifeless face. In 1960, it was the surrealist photographer Man Ray who also tried to capture the mystery of the young woman, creating a series of photographs of a new cast of her face. But no matter how many artists attempted it, the mystery remained unsolved. Only the woman herself could tell us what she was thinking when she threw herself into the river. But for obvious reasons, she could no longer do so. Except this young woman never committed suicide, and certainly not in the Seine. According to some accounts, the face likely belonged simply to a model, or perhaps even to the daughter of a mask maker. It is entirely possible, moreover, that the mask was cast while the young woman was still alive. What is certain, however, is that the drowning in the Seine is pure fiction. Like a certain Molière, the young woman was stripped of the moment of her death, which was twisted, altered, reimagined and transformed into popular legend. All to sell a mask. Well played, all of Paris clamored to get one thanks to this little fable. Because we love a good mystery that cannot be solved. Of course it is impossible to know what lies behind that smile. It is because we don't know that we are captivated and that we buy a mask. Yet, some have seen a clue in the young woman's smile. A clue that she had glimpsed what lay beyond, and that there was nothing to fear. You are walking through a dark tunnel. In the distance, you see a light. Voices echo in the shadows. You think you recognize one, a loved one who left before you, telling you to turn back, to return from where you came, that people are still waiting for you back there. You wake up. You are not in your bed. You feel as if you are floating. Looking down, you realize you are hovering over your bedroom. You see someone in your bed. You recognize them. It is you. You have probably already heard these testimonies. They are near-death experiences, very vivid visions perceived by people on the brink of death, often during cardiac arrest before they are resuscitated. And perhaps you have been shouting at your screen for the past half hour for me to talk about it. Because, yeah, couldn't near-death experiences be the obvious answer to my question? A person, as they are dying, see their life flash before their eyes, walk through the tunnel, hear loved ones on the other side, and then it ends. Testimonies from people who have lived through near-death experiences do exist. Numbers vary greatly depending on the study, but for simplicity's sake, we can agree on the following range. Between 10 and 20% of people who have come close to death report a near-death experience. The most well-known accounts are generally positive visions, accompanied by feelings of calm and peacefulness, but there are also reports of anxiety-filled visions, intense fear of death, and terror at leaving loved ones behind. Explanations vary depending on who you ask. For some, these experiences are proof of an afterlife or the existence of the soul. For more rational minds, each symptom can be explained by phenomena occurring in the brain. For instance, the tunnel vision could be caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain, gradually eliminating peripheral vision and creating the impression of a tunnel. What is undeniable, though, is that for people returning from a near-death experience, what they lived through is real to them and affects them, positively or negatively. The personal consequences of a near-death experience are indisputable. The question that interests me, though, is whether these experiences really have anything to do with death. Does someone who does not return see the same things described by survivors? Life flashing before their eyes, the sensation of being out of their body, and so on? In 2022, an article published in the scientific journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience described the case of an 87-year-old patient who died from cardiac arrest following a severe brain injury, yet whose brain activity briefly persisted after the heart stopped. This was recording using an electroencephalogram, and the recordings showed brain waves typically associated with a specific type of memory processing. While the heart was stopped, the brain was still working, activating the patient's memory. Was the patient seeing their life flash before their eyes? Or a particularly precious memory? Could this simply be material evidence of what is experienced in the final moments? Cautiously, the authors wrote, "It is intriguing to speculate that such activity could support a last recall of life that may take place in the near-death state." It's easy to get carried away reading those words. Several mainstream media outlets reporting on the story didn't hold back. "Life really does flash before your eyes at point of death, a landmark study suggests." Even though the article itself notes that the patient's brain injury, anesthesia, and medications could have altered the activity of the brainwaves, and that this is presented only as a speculation based on one case. Not to mention criticisms from other research teams, particularly the risk of what they call a muscle artifact, the possibility that the brain waves recorded by the electroencephalogram are actually just muscle contractions. This is apparently quite common, especially caused by forehead muscles. The electrical activity of muscles is misinterpreted as brain activity. And so our material proof gradually disappears, or at least must be taken with increasing caution. So why do I talk about this study? Because, in my view, it illustrates our powerlessness in understanding the moment of death. Speculations and hypotheses can be made, but there is no consensus, no fully reliable record, no proof. Death is difficult to observe, or only observable retrospectively. Rare cases are not generalizable, and studies on humans cannot be conducted for ethical reasons. I particularly like the conclusion of another 2023 publication from the same journal dealing with brain activity at the moment of death. The article, over about 15 pages, reviews near-death experience reports, methods of measuring brain activity, and studies on animals. It's a well-documented, instructive read, which concludes: we may never find direct evidence to correlate subjectively reported near-death experiences with the neurophysiological changes in a dying human brain, because by default, we cannot ask the dying patient whether they experience a memory recall while they died. Translation: we would have to ask dead people what they felt to be certain. Without that, we will likely never know what passes through someone's mind at the moment of death. No matter how many studies we conduct, unless we learn to make the dead speak, we will never know what happens in that final instant. In Station 11, someone tries to help Arthur Lander when he collapses on stage. The spectator, Jevan, rises from the front row, sensing that something is wrong, steps onto the stage and attempts to revive the actor. But before his eyes, Arthur dies. Years and years later, this vision returns to his mind. At the same time, Jevan also recalls the snow falling outside that night and his brother's apartment. After living an entire life, he revisits these images, and the final moments of this actor become just one instant among many. A legendary passing, probably the most flamboyant death he has ever witnessed. And it is only a moment which, once filtered through time, is no more remarkable than any other. Death has passed, and the living continue to move forward. I don't know if there is any use in knowing what someone thinks at the end. In reality, we probably wouldn't know what to do with that knowledge. Perhaps it is the mystery of that moment that draws our interest, and once discovered, the answer might lose its allure. We would file this certainty alongside all the others, without making much of it. Ultimately, although they captivate the living, the final moments belong deeply to the dead. The last eruption of consciousness before the light fades, the final proof of thought, will be known only to the person who dies, like the meaning behind the smile of the unknown woman of the Seine, the wounded bird in Arthur's hand, or the last 60 flickers of life from the crew of the Obra Dinn. But this proof won't be memorized, preserved, or recorded. It will be expressed, then vanish along with the person's life. And we, on the other side, will be left with the question unanswered: what goes through a person's mind as they are dying? Until, eventually, it is our turn to answer it.